Remember, folks, the views and opinions expressed throughout the broadcast day are those of the speakers, not necessarily those of the station, its staff, or underwriters. Time will be made available for other viewpoints. Thanks for joining us. Let's kick it off to John and Mary.
Good morning and welcome to Heroes and Patriots. This program is about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, February 2nd, 2023, and we are coming to you live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio. I'm Mary MASSEY, co-host, and I am joined by John SAKOWICZ. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, I'm calling in to the show here, and I want to thank Javi for facilitating the show. I'm calling in from the East Coast, where I'll be visiting the Army Cyber Institute, and I'm taking a course on the emerging disruptive technologies on the weapons of mass destruction. And it's interesting that part of the mass destruction that we're covering is the destruction of the internet and also of the international banking system. And I hope to be bringing some of this curriculum into our show for our audience in the future.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank our engineer today, Javi Rodriguez. He's filling in for Dorothy. Archives of this program and all shows can be heard at kmud.org, our program website, heroespatriots.org, and on social media. Listeners have the opportunity to call in with questions and comments. That number to call, 707-923-9311. On December 21st, 2022, President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke to Congress. Here to speak on the core facts is James Carden. Mr. Carden is a former advisor to the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission at the U.S. Department of State. He has written for many media outlets, including The Nation, The American Conservative, and Responsible Statecraft. So we'd like to bring into the show Mr. James Carden. Mr. Carden, are you with us?
I am. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you for being our guest this morning for the next 30 minutes. On the 24th of February, we will be coming up on 1 year since Russia invaded Ukraine. And there's been a variety of response from NATO countries and those surrounding Ukraine. I wondered if you would just reflect briefly before we get into your core facts and your article about how is this war helping or hurting the global efforts?
Global efforts towards
just security, policy, etc.
Well, I mean, in the area in which the war is being waged, I guess let's start in the region. What is it doing for regional European security? It's endangering it. This war has gone on far too long. It's been underreported in the press that in April of last year, only 2 months or a month or so really into the conflict, the Russians and Ukrainians were close to a ceasefire. The Ukrainians were encouraged to pull out of that via Boris Johnson, who was at the time Prime Minister of England. What has it done for the rest of the world? Well, it's damaged food. There are now enormous food insecurity problems in Africa. The only people who have benefited from this war that, as you say, is going to be going on for a year now, is the arms industry in the United States. The sanctions that the Biden administration put on Russia have backfired. Recent reports show that these sanctions haven't hurt Russia's economy at all. Indeed, Russia's economy, I believe, will have grown while the economy of the UK has shrank. So, our Western partners are not, faring all that well due to the sanctions. And neither are we. So the depressing thing about this is that there's been no real push from the United States towards a diplomatic settlement. And I think that's what really the Biden administration ought to be focusing on as we approach the 1-year anniversary of this conference.
Right. Go ahead, John.
Mr. Carden, I wanted to ask you, as someone who's worked as a national defense contractor in Afghanistan and Iraq, we in our lifetime we've suffered through 3 wars: Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and all 3 wars were very similar. No total victory was possible in any of those 3 wars, and all of those 3 wars seemed to be endless. They dragged on for years and years. Why does it seem to be palatable to the American people that we fight yet another endless war in the Ukraine with no possible total victory?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think part of the problem, and this is something that the famous international relations scholar John Mearsheimer has spoken about, is that, you know, we've been able to execute these endless wars really without too much of a cost to ourselves. Now, that's obviously not to minimize the deaths of the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who died in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. But they are nothing on the scale, say, of the losses that we accrued in Vietnam. And of course, with the exception of the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center 20 years ago, you know, these wars really haven't touched us at all. So they've come really without a societal, a major societal cost. And of course, the government and the people who are, you know, ostensibly here to represent the American people are addicted to these things because they are profitable. And they profit, as I said earlier, they profit the arms industry. And the arms industry funnels a lot of that money back to these politicians in the form of political donations.
You know, in your article, you mentioned
Mary, if I could jump in just for a follow-up question on that, please, and then I'll turn over the mic to you. That's a really important point, Mr. Carden, because it would seem to me that the biggest chunk of so-called Ukraine aid funding has never left the Washington D.C. Beltway area. That the world's 5 largest weapons dealer are found right in that Beltway area, and it seems to me that most of that Ukraine aid has never left the Beltway. Is that true?
Well, that's exactly right. And the other thing that is important to realize is that a lot of the material aid that's been promised to Ukraine has not yet reached them. So we've been able to supply them with various forms of ammunition and artillery. But there was a big fuss recently over the promise to send the Abrams tank over there. Well, the Abrams tanks aren't going to reach them by the time the war ends. We're not loading tanks onto a ship and sending them over. They have to be made from scratch. So it's very unlikely that the war will still be going on by the time these tanks are ready. And of course, there are other problems with, sending over, Patriot missile batteries, for instance. Well, it takes a very long time to train up soldiers on how to use these things. And I think that's something that perhaps your listeners would be surprised to hear, is that, there's a contingent of Ukrainian soldiers being trained by the U.S. Army right now in Oklahoma. So, the thing that people really need to keep in mind is that, Joe Biden has made us, at least unofficially anyway, but certainly in the eyes of the Russians, a co-belligerent in this war.
I wanted to continue with that idea that much of the funding has never left Washington, D.C. How do we know this? How do we know that this is going back to weapons dealers in the area? How is that revealed?
Well, it's revealed by the fact that the material that we promised the Ukrainians
Mm-hmm.
are manufactured by these companies, right? So we've come. So General Milley has come out. He came out months ago now, and basically said at a press conference that we're getting towards the end of our stocks, right? We're getting towards the end of stuff that we can actually supply to
Mm-hmm.
them. And incidentally, the German chancellor also said something similar around that same time. That was about 2-3 months ago. So, the stuff that we are sending them, the artillery, the ammunition, the tanks, the HIMARS, right? The
Mm-hmm.
high mobility artillery rocket systems, the M777 howitzers, all of the Javelin missiles. So these are made by the companies in Northern Virginia.
John, did you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, Mary. And also thank you, Mr. Carden, for being on the show. I really respected your experience as an advisor to the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission at the Department of State. You've got a very strong resume in this area. During this last week, I was at the inauguration, if you will, of Louise Richardson, the new president of Carnegie Corporation, and there were many dignitaries in the audience, and one was the editor of the Atomic Science Bulletin, and of course that's the group that manages the Doomsday Clock, and the Doomsday Clock has never been closer to midnight than it is right now. It would seem that the war in Ukraine is increasingly risking nuclear apocalypse for us here on Earth, with no compromise settlement in sight. Please talk about that risk. Thank you.
Well, they're right. The risk, is extremely high because, the risk was high to begin with. So even if this hadn't happened, right, even if Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine last February, we were already unacceptably close because, unfortunately, over the past several years, what we have is a situation where our militaries, and people forget this now because Ukraine crowds out everything, but our militaries are nose to nose in Syria. When we do these high-level, enormous military and naval exercises in the Black Sea, and of course there have been a number of close calls in the air over the Baltic Sea. Still worse, the architecture of arms control agreements that was built up painstakingly during the course of the Cold War has been all but torn apart. And now we're partly to blame for that, or actually mostly to blame for it now that I think about it. It began in 2002 when George W. Bush, at the behest of possible presidential candidate John Bolton, tore up the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty. Trump tore up the INF and the open skies. The only thing standing now is New START. So, we're at a, things didn't just get bad between the United States and Russia in February of last year. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. So we've been at an unacceptably, a perilous point with the Russians for years now.
Will you talk about Russia's insane policy of "quote unquote" escalate to de-escalate?
Escalate to de-escalate. yeah, I mean, that is that is obviously poses unacceptable risks. I think the, the the problem that we're facing now is are two things. First of all, the situation on the ground in Ukraine uh, is quite dire. I think that an extension of this war only will serve to uh, hurt Ukraine, and of course there isn't really a united alliance as much as the media pretends that there is um, within NATO. So what we're dealing with are, we have an increasingly deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians on the ground. But of course, the NATO alliance is in the process of fracturing over this whole thing. So
Right.
it's a extremely fraught moment in the war.
There is an argument that if we and NATO and other surrounding countries do not take action against Russia, that it weakens the area and sends the message to Russia that they can pretty much get away with anything, and puts the rest of the NATO surrounding countries in particular in harm's way. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think it presupposes um, that Russia is interested in conquering those other countries, even if they could. They've proven that they can't
Right.
by their military performance, but the idea that um, they want to reestablish a kind of Soviet era
Hmm.
hegemony over Poland in the Baltic states doesn't seem to me to be realistic, because it doesn't take into account the fact that Ukraine, and particularly the parts of Ukraine that 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 we're talking about here, and by that I mean the Donbass, the southeastern parts of Ukraine that had for centuries been very, tied into the Russian Empire,
Right.
and the people there are indeed ethnically Russian. They speak Russian. That situation isn't the same in Poland or the Baltic, or for the Baltic states, to say nothing of Hungary or Romania. So it's a completely different. It's a completely different situation. This isn't. They didn't just decide to roll into Ukraine because they thought that would be the first step to taking back their Eastern European empire. This is basically, and this was maybe a topic for another time, but it's unfinished. It's really unfinished business from the end of the Cold War.
Right.
And in the end, maybe I should say from the beginning, it's really been a very ugly war between brothers over a border.
It's 20 minutes past the hour. We are speaking with James Carden, who is a former advisor to the U.S. Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission for the Department of State. We have about 8 or so minutes left with you, and I wonder if you would weigh in on, if we did nothing or Germany didn't send tanks and et cetera, what is the position we should take?
The position we should take on the war. I'm sorry.
Yeah, should we be involved in any fashion?
Yes, it's facilitating a peace between the two sides, and that's a position that we should have taken in 2015, when the Minsk process began. The Minsk process was a peace process involving Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany, known as the Normandy Quartet, and it provided a pathway to settle the issues between the two countries that came up in the aftermath of the Maidan Revolution in 2014 and Russia's invasion or its assistance to the rebels in the eastern part of the country. And that, unfortunately, at every turn, the United States did nothing to push our Ukrainian clients to the negotiating table, and so the Minsk process lingered and ultimately failed. Obviously, because Putin decided that the only way to redress the issues was to invade.
Right.
And I think that's what we need to do now. I don't really see any hope right now as Russia is gearing up with approximately 500,000 to 700,000 troops. They're poised to launch a new offensive to finish this thing off. So I'm actually pretty pessimistic. Even if we did somehow, by some miracle, have enlightened people in the U.S. government.
Mr. Carden, we have a caller. I'd like to take that call before we have to say goodbye to you. Caller, go ahead with your question.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Carden, for this excellent show. And my point is exactly where you were going in terms of enlightened leadership and an honest accounting of the war and the possibility for peace. Where is that leadership, and where is how to reach the American public that you rightly say is so unaware of what's going on? What do you think are the best ways of doing that? It's vitally vitally important.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I appreciate it. I would say that it's nearly non-existent in Washington. I would say that the polls that I've seen are encouraging, though. The American people seem to understand what's at stake. And I would just urge people who think that, that we need to come to a peaceful, negotiated resolution to this conflict should pick up the phone and call their elected representatives. That's about the only way I can see the people here come to their senses. So anyone listening who is opposed to this, our participation in this, should really contact their elected representatives, because in Washington, in elected and appointed office, there are precious few people who are interested in seeing this end anytime soon.
Do you feel it was wrong for Zelensky to be in front of Congress in December?
Yes, absolutely. I'm against. It's not simply Zelensky. I'm against that whole tradition of having foreign leaders come and address the Congress. I think it's been completely. Well, let's put it in perspective here. Zelensky has appeared in front of Congress by video and in person, and his wife also appeared. So that's 3 times, right, over the course of the past year.
Correct.
The Zelenskys have made a direct pitch over the head of the American people to Congress. Churchill appeared in his entire life 3 times before Congress, and I don't think it would surprise anyone to hear that Benjamin Netanyahu, in his many years in office, has also appeared 3 times. I think it's a terrible tradition, and I think that Zelensky, for all his bravery, I'm not entirely sure that we know the full story about what's going on there in Kiev. It's quite possible that he has no option, given the people who he's surrounded with, to pursue. I think he would be prohibited from pursuing a negotiated settlement, given the people who make up the Interior Ministry and some of these far-right battalions.
So, Mr. Carden, that was actually going to be my last question put to you in the precious half an hour we have with you. Who surrounds Zelensky? And I would maintain that that because he came into power as a result of a U.S.-backed coup in 2014, that in part it's the CIA who surrounds Zelensky. It's the State Department who surrounds Zelensky. the United States has got a long history of entering these endless wars with CIA-backed dictators. Be it in Vietnam, there was in the early '60s there was a coup, and 20 years of war that followed. Saddam Hussein was a CIA puppet before he flipped on us. Osama bin Laden was a CIA puppet before he flipped on us. We have a long history of U.S.-backed coups that create so-called democracies, which are not. They're corrupt one-party systems. And here we are, a deja vu all over again in the Ukraine. Please comment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that he's probably surrounded by the defense and intelligence establishment in this country and in NATO. I mean, I'm sure listeners would be surprised to hear that at least before the war, there are NATO offices in Kiev, and the U.S. had an army base in Ukraine. So he's surrounded by that. He's influenced by his flatterers on Capitol Hill, and of course, the people who make up the security and intelligence apparatus in Ukraine are very hardline, and some of them indeed are have links to these far right militias and battalions, such as Right Sector and the Azov Battalion. So I think that it's possible that they are also dependent on one another. And by what I mean by that is I would urge people to look into Zelensky before he became president. His name is prominently mentioned in the Panama Papers, right? So he has a lot at stake, not just his life. He has many millions of dollars, in offshore accounts. He's like everyone else in power in that country. He has deep connections to corrupt oligarchy there. So the idea that this guy is, a representative, a shining light, beacon of democracy, is nonsense and propaganda. It isn't to say, by the way, that the Russians were right to invade. The war should be denounced, but we should be working to find a way to end the war and not continue it, and not keep enriching these defense contractors in Northern Virginia.
James Carden, how can folks get access to your many articles and so forth? What's the best way to do so?
So I am on the board of a group, 501c3, that was started by the late Professor Stephen F. Cohen, called the American Committee for the U.S.-Russia Accord. The website is usrussiaaccord.com, and it's a group of distinguished former ambassadors, business leaders, and political figures such as former presidential candidate, U.S. Senator Bill Bradley, Ambassador Jack Matlock, and the nation's Katrina vanden Heuvel.
Well, our time is up with you, and we thank you so much for reporting on this aspect of the Ukraine-Russian war. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
James Carden is a former advisor to the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission at the U.S. Department of State. He has written for The Nation, The American Conservative, Responsible Statecraft, and as I said, many other outlets. We're going to take a brief pause at 9:31 and be back with our next guest, Thomas Ferguson. In our next segment, we are joined by Professor Thomas Ferguson. He co-published the article, Why Did FTX Spend So Much on Politicians? Professor Thomas Ferguson is a professor emeritus, University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Director of Research, Institute for New Economic Thinking. He just co-authored the piece, Bankman-Fried, Political Money, and the Crash of FTX with Jen Shin. Dr. Ferguson, are you with us?
Well, I am indeed. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for being a part of our broadcast this morning.
Sure, glad to do it, even though where I'm living, they're forecasting chill factors of minus 35. So I'm sort of
Ooh.
feeling I might be living in Siberia without even knowing it.
Well, we do hope you stay warm and hopefully can stay indoors. Talk about your article and the FTX phenomenon. Of course, many of us have been following the Sam Bankman-Fried arrest and so forth. And I see recently he was just reprimanded in terms of bail for contacting a potential witness in his trial.
Yeah.
Talk about that whole phenomenon of FTX, and maybe you could even explain what FTX is for our listeners who may not know.
Well, FTX was actually a crypto exchange where you effectively bought crypto and could perhaps get out of it, although a lot of people, of course, didn't get out of it.
Right.
It's tied, however, to a whole network of them. We ought to probably go back one stage, though, to the crypto phenomenon.
Okay.
Now, one has to begin by saying, look, people will strongly disagree on this, but there's not much to be done except that most of the people who held very strong pro-crypto opinions now have had to sort of trim their sails quite a lot because of the billions of dollars that have gone down the drain. I'll tell you what I think. Crypto was essentially always junk in this sense. It was claiming to be really a new money. And the appeal of it was, this is a money that's completely beyond the control of governments. And if people claimed it was super safe because of the blockchain technology, none of that turned out to be completely true at all. In fact, none of it was true in the sense that people can hack blockchain. People lost large sums. That blockchain is an interesting thing, but it's not equivalent to crypto. People who were claiming crypto was effectively they would do you your own form of money. It is the easiest way to think about that is to think of it as a 21st century revival of wildcat banking. Wildcat banking back in the bad old days, mostly before the Civil War, where banks issued their own notes. They claimed they would, the usual promise was, we're going to give you bring us some money, we'll take a deposit, and you can come back anytime and get your, I'll use this loaded language for clarity, real money. In the meantime, take our paper, and the paper should then pass around. Well, what they all did again and again in the bad old days of unregulated banking was everybody overissued the paper. My favorite case is the private wildcat banks in the state of Michigan, which a great old book by a guy named Ray Hammond, Banking and Politics in the Age of Jackson, tells you the story of how all the banks, they knew they didn't have nearly enough reserves to cover withdrawals, so they all pooled the reserves, and then they bribed the banking superintendent who went around to certify the banks were sound, and they would just move the same old reserves around from bank to bank, depending on where that supervisor was going. That, of course, they all eventually went bust, and so did the folks. They lost their dough there. Mm-hmm. Now, I never believed the story that crypto was somehow going to be stable. Paper money issuing with no barrier isn't stable. And by the way, the price of gold is not stable either. And so sort of stories about stable coins, they were always the equivalent of animal fables, to be blunt, or something. They're just fairy tales. They're not true. And so you could be pretty sure this was not going to end well. And then you get, it's always the case in this type of financial, the nicest thing I could call it is we'll hope we're not going to go to court this morning. that they don't quite realize how utterly fraudulent it is. But this type of financial fable ends always in a wave of disasters. With the difference that while we've had a lot of crypto stuff go bust, this isn't over. The interests, the big money interests in crypto are very large. You know, the judge when FTX went down, they've kept the list of people who had money in it, as distinct from the equity owners, is still not public. They ought to make that public, in my opinion. But lots of folks were when you hit an age of high inflation, the subject of another paper I wrote with Sarvas Storm, different from Paul Jorgensen and Ji Chen, who I wrote the FTX paper with. You get folks looking around for, in effect, a miracle way out. And so I think some people thought they'd be proof against any screw up. Well, they weren't. If you study the regulatory situation with this, what you discover, I think, is that there are several possible regulators, although the legal authority for parts of them is not, I think, totally clear. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission has been trying not to regulate crypto. They're basically, I read them as in the hands of the crypto advocates, basically. And then the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, where Gary Gensler was the chair, I think actually would like to regulate. I think they were actually a little slower to regulate than they should have been, but they realized the problem. They were under massive political pressure not to do anything until, one after the other, the crypto companies began to go bust. There is still a tremendous amount of money behind this. I was just looking at the announced composition of the Senate subcommittee that will deal specifically with crypto, and it's got a large number of strong crypto advocates in it, and it's got some big skeptics too, like California Representative Brad Sherman. But I mean, it's like, why is anybody pushing this? And there have been efforts to, the Biden administration's Labor Department got around finally to sort of forbid sending warnings to pension funds that wanted to invest in crypto. Large numbers of crypto folks were pushing to get pension funds into it. That's crazy stuff. I mean, that battle is, the Labor Department did issue the ruling, but it's clear that people are going to try to come back and revisit it. I mean, this fight isn't over. It should be over. What's keeping this balloon going with no air in it is just tons of political money. I've real trouble with a lot of the press coverage of this. Much of it focused on Bankman-Fried himself and claimed he was a big Democrat. A lot of people claimed he was a left-wing Democrat. When you study it, we showed you that was absolute nonsense. We should observe that you can read our paper on the Institute for New Economic Thinking website. It's right there. It's pretty easy to find if you Google it. We did a rather more thorough job than the rest of the news, so we found a lot more money. We typically do that because we spend a lot more time combing through this stuff and use other techniques that other people don't. Like we make a big search for for the individual private contributions besides political action committees and things like that. Anyway, bottom line on this is that no, he didn't. It was not a liberal democratic scheme. The company itself was giving massively to both sides. Even Bankman-Fried was giving a lot of money to Republicans, as he finally admitted. And, it's a case study in how not to cover political money. Do a sort of thorough thing and print what the guys are saying. He had a language full of philanthropic initiatives and things, though he also said that he never bothered to read books and didn't think he needed them. Now, of course, he had problems in the end balancing books, not just reading them. But hey, my sense is that this was it's sort of an exemplary case where thin media coverage by reporters who won't ask even very elementary questions and who don't really want to do a lot of work, combined with the will of a lot of people to believe to sort of hype it. Now, a lot of folks are out of money. They're not going to see that money back. That's pretty clear. It'll be interesting to see what finally we come back to and how much money finally comes back. But we'll just have to see here. But I would just stress very strongly, this battle should have been over already. It is not. It is the lobbying and battling over crypto just continues. It's not done. It's amazingly strong. It's like this is like, well, it's if you like, zombie political economy where something that should be dead is walking around.
John?
Yeah, it's I don't know where to begin.
I can see your eyes.
They're glazing over. Well, Mary, I work in this area, so
yeah, this is your thing. I'm staying quiet.
So, Professor Ferguson and I communicated a little bit offline, and he knows that I'm part of the FinCEN task force at U.S. Treasury. That's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and just this last Tuesday, we made a major bust. Tuesday the 17th, we made an arrest in Miami, but opened up the indictment at the Brooklyn Federal Court against Anatoly Lekotomov for operating a cryptocurrency exchange called Blisado, and which is part of something much larger called Hydra. So, call me a skeptic, call me a cynic, but in working in this area for as long as I have, in working for FinCEN, and also in working on a biography for the guy who developed Silk Road, which led to the darknet, the deep web, and the dark web, a guy by the name of Ross Ulrich, who's sitting in a federal supermax in Tucson, Arizona. I've come to believe, either cynically, call me what you will, that the entire cryptocurrency market and the darknet market is nothing more than something to facilitate shadow government and the shadow banking system and organized crime. In looking at what Legmanov did, he facilitated billions of dollars in money laundering for organized crime bosses, ransomware actors, arms merchants, drugs lords, terrorist financing actors, sex traffickers, black market oil brokers, you name it. The darknet and cryptocurrency is the marketplace for, the dark side of all there is in the world. Professor Ferguson, tell me I'm wrong.
Well, I'd say I'm not that far from you on this point. The only thing I'd say is you're giving too much credit to the above ground regular banks, meaning these folks do a lot of money laundering too. After all, there were some great cases there. Even in recent years, I'm trying to remember the one. Was it the Shanghai bank that I think that was the New York State Banking Commissioner who actually filed on. There are a lot of grotesque cases. So in that sense, and I would add that I am not a fan of shadow banking. I think that stuff should be regulated like banks. Period. Point. End of story. But not all shadow banking is the same as crypto, meaning an awful lot of shadow banking is folks trying to, often in mortgage markets and things like that. And, we have had one world class crash, dozen or so years ago, thanks to that kind of stuff. I'm not at all telling you that shadow banking is a problem. It's an enormous problem, and it's not regulated well for the same reasons that crypto isn't regulated, from basically political money and political influence. But that said, you're right. I think it's clear that crypto was like a perfect vehicle for large numbers and amounts of stuff that should have been illegal. Though I'd urge against some of the stuff around where there are claims, for example, that this was the way. There's a lot of I think wild claims about how the Ukraine was funneling money to Sam Bankman-Fried. I can't see it. Now, nobody has seen, to my knowledge, other than some federal authorities, the international affiliates of this. But I doubt you're going to find that. It's pretty clear to me that the main story here was probably made in America for most of this. Not that there wasn't a large amounts of international money coming in as they got going. That's clearly the case.
Yeah.
And these birds were all themselves mostly hovering offshore, outside the territorial limits of the United States. But no, I'm not. Look, I think the one thing you learn, particularly when you look at some of the Gabriel Zeckman and others' papers on offshore money, just enormous amounts of the financial system go into existence out there. They live in this netherworld. Now, it is clearly the case, I think, that our authorities could make those transparent overnight. That when they don't want to do it, not just the American government, the British government has often tried to protect, especially various British dependencies in the Caribbean and elsewhere, from regulation. I know I've bumped into folks in various central banks there, and we all know about the Panama Papers. So, right. No, I don't disagree with this at all. This is just ridiculous. It's quite worth paying attention to the fine print in a lot of Federal Reserve reports when they start to talk about the money supply and things like that. And then they'll just tell you, well, of course, and somewhere on a footnote, this doesn't take account of what might be completely offshore. They don't use that language. That's what they mean.
So, Professor,
I'm not denying this for a second. We have a serious problem here, and I don't actually think we're making much progress on this. It's just ridiculous that private investigators somehow have to crack into things like the Panama Papers.
Right. So, Professor Ferguson, you're my go-to guy, along with Bill Black, the professor of economics and law that Michael Moore
I know
features.
Bill Black for years. Yep.
Yeah, he's great. I mean, both of you are great. You're just national treasures when it comes to black market banking. And he and I talked about how Sam Bankman-Fried propped up his balance sheet. So as he knew that he was losing money in his Artemis trading platform, and he also lost more than $100 million in offshore poker games and gambling addiction, just losing money. The way he propped up his balance sheet was to mint not a new cryptocurrency, but non-fungible tokens that he, again, like with cryptocurrencies, just arbitrarily assigned a value to, and that became the collateral that backed up loans from the exchange platform to the trading platform and vice versa, back and forth. These non-fungible tokens became the collateral, and again, it was just all imaginary. It was all through the looking glass type of money. Where are the regulators? Where are the regulators?
I'm not telling you that I don't feel at all inclined to defend the regulators. Depending on exactly how they did those transactions, they probably fell within the realm of the CFTC, Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Now, they just don't want to regulate. I do not disagree with Dennis Kelleher at Better Markets, which has put out, I think, some of the best material on this, that it's obvious the CFTC doesn't want to regulate. And they were, I should add that this then shows up in Congress as a split between the Agriculture Committee, which gets to instruct and regulate the CFTC folks, as against the banking committees, where if it were the SEC, they'd probably be looking at them. And I'm not telling you that anybody was doing their job. They were plainly not doing their job. And I actually, much as I admire and like Gary Gensler, I think the SEC was a little slow on this too, though it is clear that they did not have major regulatory authority here. They were trying to get it. But no, they were all, I'm also pretty clear about why that is. It was massive political pressures, which were also included pressures, I think, coming from the White House. And I think the crypto people had plenty of friends in the White House, including, it is, having said what was obvious, that FTX and the others were all going completely bipartisan here. They were also putting plenty of money into the Democratic Party and the Biden administration's political coffers, legally, so that, and they had a whole load of revolving door lobbyists. So it's not. The pressure, they were in effect trying to corrupt the whole system of government here. It seems to me. Right. In a non-technical sense of corrupt. Mostly it seems nearly all legal.
Yeah, that's what I was fishing for here. That's what I wanted you to say. They were corrupting government across the board. When you look at the filings that were made in the bankruptcy proceedings earlier this week, and I'm sure you've seen them.
I haven't seen the latest. No, I have not seen those.
Yeah, you have or you have not?
I have not seen this week's, or I have seen them up to this week. Yeah. Yeah.
So it has the creditor matrix, and it's a dozen public relation firms, including some with ties to the defense industry. The hired guns, the elected members of Congress. It's just staggering how Sam Bankman-Fried was able to buy so much influence. It's just. He was attempting, as you say, to corrupt government across the board.
It's freed his colleagues and a whole nest of institutions allied with him.
We have a caller for you, Dr. Ferguson, and we only have about 3 minutes. So caller, please be brief, and we'll wind up the show with this.
So Professor Ferguson, thank you so much for this important show. Who's higher than the regulators and the political leaders? Where do we go for the higher powers that's going to sort of rein this in? Is there the public awareness? Who's out there that's going to make a change?
Well,
thank you,
on this type of stuff, I think Senator Warren actually is pretty good. In the case of financial irresponsibility, we've got some political folks who've actually done okay. Elizabeth Warren, I think, does okay. On the political money front, I think everybody, though she included, has been mostly paying lip service. There isn't any, as far as I can tell, there's no serious movement on trying to rein in political money. And you just had. When she was Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi was openly defending speculating in the stock market while you write the laws. Now, this is a case where I think the reform Democratic, I give on this particular issue, some of the progressive Democrats were really pretty good. They haven't been great in general on the importance of the financial shenanigans. They recognize it. AOC was terrific in one hearing that I can recall, but it's not been, money in politics has just sort of faded out of the show. I'm not telling you this story has a happy ending.
Right.
The only hope here, as usual, is that so many people have lost so much money that you might be able to build some popular indignation, and some politicians will accept it. The difficulty there is, as I've written elsewhere, the structure, the highly structured character of political money now, where huge amounts of it come down from the top leadership in either the National Committee or in the Congressional Committee, the Senate and House committees that collect so much money. And that makes everybody rather more reluctant to speak out.
The article is "Why Did FTX Spend So Much Money on Politicians?" by Dr. Thomas Ferguson. We're going to say goodbye to you. We're out of time. Thank you for being our guest this morning.
Tom Ferguson, thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you.
That is our program for February 2nd. We'll be back the first Thursday in March. Thank you so much.